struggling to figure out, how they enable transfers, particularly in the privacy space. This is where we've seen it first. And so there are different models developing. You have the cross-border privacy rules, where effectively governments sort of agree with each other that yes, your privacy regime looks pretty similar to ours. It's got the guardrails we expect, and then companies can certify that they meet those CBPR standards. And for any country which is in the sort of club or the regime, once you're certified, you can move data on that basis within those countries. The GDPR has a few other types of mechanisms. You can use model clauses within your company. You can transfer data based on consent, or, as we've seen in the discussion with Safe Harbor and its adequacy determinations, the European Commission can decide that another country has the kind of regime where data can transfer. But that's a bilateral system. And then there are countries that are looking at mechanisms where you actually need sort of an individual permission from the government to move different data sets. That probably creates the most friction. And sort of the question going forward, I think, from if we'll call it a trade facilitation perspective, is which of those models can accomplish the goals of the regulators, but yet at the same time, create the least friction in the kind of data transfers that we see would be really beneficial for economies and societies. Does anyone else want to take up, maybe, Joe, the question of regulators themselves and how we bring them into the conversation? All of you.
Thanks very much. I think that is a great question, and it's a great question in the context of trade negotiations. A couple of comments that link back to what others on the panel have said. Number one, I would look at the Good Regulatory Practices chapter of the USMCA. It's an excellent chapter, an excellent recitation of a number of countries agreeing on standards that are, I guess you could say, grounded in the Administrative Procedures Act. But one of the things to think about and look at there is, are there any ways to further enhance or refine or advance those provisions? But the provisions include elements such as notice and comment, 60-day period, when new regulations are advanced, having the regulator provide an explanation for which comments they accepted, which comments they rejected, and why, and providing substantial evidence and the evidence upon which the regulations are based. That kind of good regulatory practice is an important piece of that shouldn't be forgotten in regulatory practice. I think in the context of very quickly evolving technology, it's important to, it's difficult because it's important sometimes to be able to move quickly, but it's also important not to prejudge or move so quickly that one makes, locks in inflexible rules that don't accommodate the needs of the marketplace. And so I think even if we look at some of the practices that have been stood up by elements in the Department of Commerce, by NTIA and NIST, those agencies have been working to go on listening tours, involve input from a wide array of stakeholders in developing regulations in this space. And I think those are also good models for other countries as well. And then just to come back to comments on AI as well, I think in addition to regulation, it's important to remember standard setting, voluntary consensus-driven standard setting in this space as well. And again, I think it's very current. We have a couple of different models that have sort of emerged across the world. There's the model of open standard setting processes that are open to many different stakeholders and have the benefit of the best that global industry has to offer. And then there are also national standard setting processes that are sometimes closed, that result in mandatory national standards that don't necessarily have that openness of input. So I think that's a second kind of process that I think is relevant in considering the regulatory frameworks.
I want to key off Robert's comment. Ambassador Holleyman mentioned interoperability as being very key, looking at privacy regulations, since countries are going to take their different approaches. And we were very glad to be the first company to sign up to the APEC CBPR. We saw it as a good, viable approach to protecting privacy on a voluntary basis, and we continue to look for that to grow. We've got GDPR, with which we're all having to comply in Europe. We've got a debate going on in the United States at the state and the federal level about how we're going to regulate privacy here, in addition to the various sectoral approaches that we have in place now. So trade agreements need to recognize that there are different ways to protect data, and if appropriate measures are taken, whatever they might be, if we can ensure that the privacy is protected of personal data, it should be allowed to move across borders. So we're working very hard to implement that. I want to mention one other thing from a regulatory standpoint. Lisa talked about the role of regulators. There are a lot of reasons that regulators want to look at data, and they need to be able to have access to data. I mentioned earlier that IBM's largest client sector is financial services. It's about 1/3 of our revenue. We work with financial institutions around the world. They have to deal with their own regulators in countries or all the countries in which they operate. And part of what we do is to make sure that those clients can comply with the data requests that they get from their regulators, that they can provide timely access. And I think this was recognized in the additional language that was put in the Financial Services chapter in USMCA, that regulators can get access to this data, so it can be allowed to move across borders as long as those financial organizations can produce the data when they're asked for it.
Liz, I think that was a great key issue really, and I just want to call out actually Privacy Shield, because you know it is a bilateral agreement, but in many respects it's a very unique bilateral agreement. Which I've done some work on this. You know, I don't often call out work we've done, but with Aditya at the World Bank, looking at the extent that Privacy Shield really is some type of model which other countries could consider asking the EU for. Similarly, because unlike the requirement to do broad country adequacy findings, which essentially requires a common privacy standard across the whole country, Privacy Shield is only there for those countries that want to opt into it in order to actually use that mechanism. And so, particularly when you think about what that means in a developing country context, that seems useful. And the other mechanisms under GDPR, essentially contracts and binding corporate rules, tend to require a presence in the EU to really utilise, which from a small business perspective is often not viable, and then cuts out a lot of the opportunities of the digital space for an app developer in India to be selling their services into the EU. So it's a key area, and I think expanding out from that, back to your original question, which is that when I look at the rules that we're getting in the trade agreements, I think they're great and they're a very important part of it, and we're moving from just preventing bad action towards encouraging forms of interoperability. So we've got some positive obligations in there. But one concern that I have, and I think that needs to be filled out more, is this regulatory cooperation piece, because my sense is that what you will see is that given the extent that data touches on economies broadly and the regulatory concerns that come up from the rapid movement of large amounts of data globally, that regulators will continue by sort of default to restrict data flows, and from a trade perspective they will end up relying very heavily on the exceptions provisions. I think one just needs to look at Vietnam, which more or less when the TPP came into effect, I think their digital trade commitments phase in anyway, but nevertheless, they've put in a fairly comprehensive set of data localization requirements, which my understanding is they will seek to justify at some point under the exceptions provision. So the rules are only going to ultimately be as effective as the buy-in and the confidence is at the domestic level that this is the right way to go, and I think to get there we need to do more work on the regulatory side.
Thanks. Before we open it up, I just want to give everyone one opportunity to set the stage for the place that you think the digital trade conversation is sort of most challenging, most interesting, has the most opportunities. It does seem like everyone is talking about digital trade now. We have the WTO, we have a lot of bilateral negotiations, some of which the US is involved in, and lots of EU and other countries are engaged in their own FTA negotiations. We also have fora like the G20, with the Japanese. I think that's a focus for them this year. So maybe just sort of one run through before we open it up about where we should be looking and what the opportunities and challenges are in each of those places.
Thank you. Thank you. So I think the areas to be looking are, number one, as everyone on the panel has been reiterating, cross-border data flows it's critical to get that right, and it's critical to move the ball forward. We have very good disciplines in place, and yet I think one data point that I've seen indicated that of all the data that has ever been created in the history of mankind, 98% of that data, recorded data, has been created in the last 2 or 3 years. And so that's a growth rate that indicates a real need to have interoperable, flexible standards that are conducive to doing business and to predictability in the space.
And again, like everybody's talking about data flows, I think that the biggest challenges are addressing the issues that governments raise when they say, well, you've got to store the data in my country. So whether it's privacy or cybersecurity or access to data by regulators or law enforcement access or regulation of AI or whatever it is that could be a legitimate concern raised by these governments, I think we collectively, industry, working with those governments, need to address those issues to give them confidence so that they will allow for cross-border flow of that data.
This is not grounded in any possible feasible reality in the short term. I would love to see the US rejoin CPTPP. And I would actually also, again, on the US-China front, we haven't spoken about China. There's obviously some fairly intensive discussions going on. I would love to see some progress on the data issue in that space as well.
So I think there are 2 issues here. One is China, and I think they have a radically different approach to data and use of data and data flows than a U.S. approach. And secondly, there is a race about who can get the rules in place for liberalization around data flows, and who gets the rules in place that in many cases, through their silence, allow restrictive provisions to be put in place. And it's great that the CPTPP countries are out there doing what they're doing. I would love the US to be part of that at some point too, but particularly in the area of data, and I actually show my prejudice here, I think probably most importantly in the area of data, it's great that the CPTPP countries have moved ahead, because until that was done and in place, there was nothing you could say was the emerging global standard for liberalization and protection of digital trade. And so whether it's e-commerce, digital trade, everything, they set the standards. And again, many of my former colleagues from government and USTR who are here and Treasury were the leaders in helping set those standards.
So we're going to open it up for questions. A reminder of our We to Ground rules. Please identify yourself, your affiliation, and especially